This is a production of Cornell University Library.
Welcome to everyone who's joined us so far. We're going to give it just another maybe 30 seconds or so to let other participants join in, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Wright, Interim Director of Mann Library, and I'd like to welcome you all to our final Chats in the Stacks book talk for fall 2020. For those of you who have attended any of the other Cornell Library talks this semester, you'll know that the book talk series has been completely virtual. While that has, of course, brought some challenges, one of the silver linings has been that we've been able to make these talks accessible to a live audience from all around the world. And we are very happy to see all of you here. For those not familiar yet with our format, I'd like to note that today's event will involve a presentation by our speaker, Dr. Janet Loebach, followed by a Q&A session. If you have a question at any point in the session, please type it into the chat box that you see as part of your webinar view. Eveline Ferretti, who administers Mann Library's public programs, is here with us today, and she will be gathering all of the questions to present them in the order received once Dr. Loebach has finished her presentation. We look forward to a very engaging discussion. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our featured author. Dr. Janet Loebach is an environmental design researcher, consultant, and professor hailing from Ontario, Canada. Currently an assistant professor in the Department of Design and Environmental Analysis at Cornell, Dr. Loebach received undergraduate and graduate training in civil engineering and environmental design and earned a PhD in children's, urban, and health geographies from Western University in Canada. She is a registered professional engineer in Ontario Province and the principal consultant for Thrive Design Consulting, a firm dedicated to designing and planning for diverse, built, and natural environments where people and communities can thrive. Dr. Loebach's research and practice focuses on children's perception and use of their everyday environments, including home, school, and neighborhood, and the socio-environmental factors which influence children's behavior and well-being. Much of her recent work has focused on understanding how children play both indoors and out, and on designing play spaces accordingly. Dr. Loebach's innovative work often integrates child-led and/or digitally enhanced methods such as behavior mapping, qualitative GIS, GPS tracking, participatory photography and videography, and place mapping. Dr. Loebach currently serves on the board of the International Play Association in Canada, the editorial board of the journal Children, Youth, and Environments, and is co-chair of the Children, Youth, and Environments Network of the Environmental Design Research Association. Her work has been published widely in a variety of leading environmental design, planning, and public health journals. And as an educator at Cornell, she teaches both undergraduate and graduate level courses in exploring human-environment relations. Today, Professor Loebach will be discussing with us the book Handbook for Designing Public Spaces for Young People, published by Routledge in June 2020, for which she is the lead editor. I'm so grateful that Dr. Loebach could join us this afternoon, and please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to join the chat in the stacks with the new book. I'm just going to be sharing my screen here. Okay. Well, thank you again for the invite, and I appreciate everyone joining this afternoon. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about this newly published book. It just came out this summer. It was quite, it was about a 3-year process, all told. So we're grateful to see it finally published. I appreciate the chance to talk about it. I'm just going to. So the book itself, as Sarah mentioned, is an edited collection. So the impetus for the book came out of the group of colleagues that edited this. We're all members of the Environmental Design Research Association, very much involved in the children and youth environments work. And the book kind of evolved after we'd been having a number of, we're always presenting and sharing about the challenges of working with youth and integrating them into research and design processes. And we realized that there was some value in preparing a book, particularly one that could be a resource not to just researchers, but it's also meant, it's been written in a way so that it can serve as a resource to designers, to municipalities, policymakers, community organizations, etc. So the overall aim of the book is really to share and help make the case for how important and how valuable public spaces are for children and youth, and that their use and participation in these spaces, we know, is critical for the whole range of their development. However, they are often, very often excluded through a number of different ways from using public spaces or participating in their planning. So this book is meant, it's divided up in a way to start with making the case for why. Why do we need to include youth in the creation of public spaces? What's the benefit for them and for communities? And then how do we do that? How do we intentionally do that? And I do want to emphasize, when we talk about designing youth inclusive spaces, public spaces, we are talking about not just designing for them, but designing with them. So the presentation today, I'm going to sort of walk through the book section, sharing a little bit about what the content of the book is in each of those sections, and a few projects. I wrote a couple of chapters myself, and I'll use those as some case studies, and just give you a snapshot of some of the other content that's included in the book. So the first question we need to sort of establish is, what do we mean? What does this mean to create an inclusive public realm? And I want to just take a second to talk about the phrase public realm. I use it interchangeably with public spaces. But when we think of public spaces, sometimes we think of it too narrowly. We think of it as primarily parks or urban plazas. But really what we're talking about in terms of the public realm is we are focusing on mostly on outdoor environments, but all of the public spaces that are accessible to the general population, and to make those spaces as youth inclusive as possible. So what we're looking at, or when you have a youth inclusive city or community, it's really that the principles, the policies, and the design are collectively creating a culture where children and youth are welcome in public spaces, and they're valued and recognized as legitimate citizens. So this includes not only the right to inhabit and occupy the public realm, but to have public spaces really reflect their needs and preferences, and that they have an opportunity to contribute to the planning and evaluation of public spaces in their communities. So we'll lead off with the why. So in this section, I'm not going to break out by chapter. I'm just going to present some of the arguments that these chapters sort of collectively are making. So the first reason why we do this is because they have the right. They have the right to use and inhabit public spaces and have them reflect their needs. And this was enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was signed in 1989. I will say all countries of the UN are signatories to the convention, with the exception of the US, although it is widely sort of accepted and adopted here. But it was meant to recognize the rights of children and youth now, not just, we tend to think of children as sort of adults in waiting, and it was really meant to recognize that they have needs and rights right now, and that includes the right to places for play and for leisure, the right to be safe in their environments and communities, and then the right to be heard and have their opinions matter in decisions and environments that affect them. So we tend to think sometimes of children as human becomings instead of human beings, and that we're concentrating on the trajectory toward adulthood. And this is about really focusing on the fact that they're active and legitimate citizens right now, and we need to provide spaces that are going to support them. Oh, another reason why we might need to specifically think about youth particularly is that they see the world and they use the world in ways very different than adults. And that's because they have very different motivations and interests and experiences. Some of those are connected to their development, but it requires that they have different environmental needs than those of adults. And so there may be certain things that they are not getting from adult-centered environments. Another key reason is that children are generally more captive to their local environments. So what I mean by that is that they have less ability to get out of their local environments. They don't drive. They often can't travel much without supervision, and they're so affected. Their health, physical and mental health, is so affected by their local environments, and when they can't escape it, what is near to them is going to be very influential. And this particularly applies to the neighborhood environment. When this is the sort of first public outdoor space that children begin to inhabit and sort of begin to negotiate beyond home. And we know from quite a bit of research, when children have the ability to, particularly independently, by independent I mean not supervised by adults, independently explore these environments, it's been connected to a range of really key developments of skills and competencies and relationships. Unfortunately, what's happened over particularly the last generation, but sort of beyond that now, is that the space that the distance from home that children are able to travel in or to occupy away from home has been steadily shrinking. And so this graphic, although it's from 1990, it's several decades old already. It still is a good illustration of this shrinking neighborhood range. So the large bubble that we see is the distance that the great-grandfather at age of 8 could walk from home. So he was allowed to walk 6 miles from home to a favorite fishing hole, go fishing on his own. And it's shrunk down. We can't really call it a bubble. It's just now a dot in the top left corner. His great-grandson at 8 is only allowed now to walk to the end of his street, which is about 300 yards. And this is not it's not just the UK. We're seeing this across most developed countries. And a study that I did myself, a small study in London, looking at how far contemporary children are allowed to travel. I apologize, this is metric still. Most children, these are children 9 to 12 years old, the furthest distance that they traveled in sort of late spring, summertime was about 2/3 of a mile. That was sort of the average. There were a few that went 1,600 meters, is about a mile. There's a few that went that far and further, but there was also as many who didn't go more than 200 meters from home. So that's about 600 feet. These are 9 to 12-year-olds during the summer, and this is pattern we're seeing. And there's a number of factors that are contributing to this. If there's not a single reason this is happening. Over the last several decades, the last generation or two, we've seen an increase in how much children are involved in structured activities. So they're busier. Parents are more cautious about letting their children play or travel unsupervised. But we're also living in different places. Tend to be in more urban areas, which is changing what amenities are nearby. There's increased traffic. And then we're also seeing a huge increase in the amount of time children are spending in sedentary activities. It's mostly screen-based, and most of that time is indoors. So what happens, these are all contributing to an overall reduction in time outdoors and in public spaces, particularly in urban areas. What we also know is that the number of children living in cities is projected to keep increasing. So right now there's about a billion children worldwide that are growing up in cities right now. By 2050, it's projected that 70% of the world's population is going to be living in urban cities, and the majority of that is going to be under 18. But unfortunately, our cities are not really doing well by our children and youth in terms of the design and the opportunities that they're providing. For example, this is a very common urban planning practice. we've gone to the point where we sort of create children's spaces. We've sort of decided that there are certain types of spaces that are legitimate for children. So playgrounds is certainly one, and we tend to fence them in literally and sometimes figuratively. But then what this means is that by default, we tend to think of other public spaces as adult spaces. And if you've ever thought of a time where you were in a public space and there were some really noisy kids or teens and you thought, that doesn't seem right. This is sort of our default. We have been acculturated to think of public spaces as primarily adult spaces, and that we have these sort of locked off spaces for kids. But then even when they're there, we still really restrict their access, their playful or their childish behavior, and their independent behavior. So there are a lot of these play spaces children are not allowed to actually go to without adult supervision. But unfortunately, as much as these play spaces, certainly have value, but the characteristics, the opportunities that they're providing are not enough to fulfill all of the characteristics that we need them to provide all the opportunities that we need them to. So we really need to be shifting to thinking about moving out of the playgrounds and really thinking about all outdoor spaces, how they can be youth inclusive, and thinking of it sort of one large open space system. And teens are particularly controlled and vilified, marginalized in spaces. There's a fair bit of research that shows that even just a group of teens sitting or standing together is actually perceived as a threat. There's something inherently threatening about it. And there's a lot of work that's been actively done to make it very difficult for youth to gather, particularly to do things like skateboard or cycle around urban areas. So we kind of create a skate park, that's the youth place, and anything else feels like it's a breach. We also have gotten quite good at creating hostile design. So we actually design youth right out of the environment, other people too, but we make it very difficult for them to sit, certainly comfortably or very long, to run, to play, to skateboard, certainly. The most egregious one, my favorite, is this mosquito alarm, which is more prevalent in the UK. But it's actually an electronic device that it emits a sound at a very high frequency that is more likely to be heard by younger people. And it's actually marketed by manufacturers as a way of discouraging kids from loitering in streets and around public or even commercial places. So many of these things are collectively contributing to the phenomenon that children and youth are really disappearing from our public spaces and our communities. And there are some significant negative consequences of that. One of which Peter Gray a few years ago did a study that statistically linked the decrease in opportunities for free play, the less frequency and duration spent outside and playing than their parents did, with a significant increase in psychopathologies among children, particularly anxiety and depression. And we're starting to notice a little bit. This article from the New York Times last year is claiming that all of these things have actually ruined childhood for kids because free play is so difficult and so rare for them. And that part of this is because there has been a fundamental shift from a number of directions in the way that we're viewing children and how to raise them. And that shift has really transformed the environments, not only the designs, but the policies that govern them. Another key reason or issue here is that children have just generally fewer opportunities to assert their environmental needs and preferences and to participate in decision making. But there's also benefit here that's more than the sum of the parts, in that when we think about design or the provision of public spaces that are welcoming and work for youth, they can actually help us to highlight issues or gaps or solutions that actually benefit other vulnerable populations. So older adults, people with mobility devices, mothers or fathers pushing strollers, people with any kind of ability issue. And so when we do that, we can actually highlight some things or change some things that are helpful to a number of populations. And way back in 1978, Colin Ward, talked about this thing that if we had these policies that improve the lives of children, they're actually going to benefit adults too, and vice versa. So a lot of those arguments are made through sort of multiple chapters in the why section. There's a few other specific pieces. So there's some arguments, or it's laid out why adolescent development is linked so much to the public realm. Makes the argument for why children need to be able to independently travel through their communities, and why that means we need to think about youth-friendly streets, not just things like parks and plazas. Things like making sure that particularly racially and ethnically marginalized youth are engaged. And there's a great chapter by Catherine Melcher that makes a great argument for why youth should actually be involved in the actual construction of public places, and how it really fosters an attachment to place that is long-term. So the second section of the book then shifts to, okay, so how do we do this? And there are a number of different mechanisms here, and we really need to be thinking on all fronts. So there, I knew this was going to happen. Sorry, one second. There we go. I predicted that was going to happen. So we need to continue conducting research that's going to help us better understand, how children and youth are using spaces now, how they're perceiving them, what are barriers to use, and what they feel are facilitators to use of public spaces, and how that connects to supporting their healthy activity and development. And then we need to take that research evidence and apply that to design initiatives, design and planning, so that we are then creating environments that are honoring and supporting these needs and preferences. And then I mentioned earlier about how this has to go hand in hand with policies. There are a number of policies that can restrict design and research and even participation. So we need to look at local ordinances and bylaws that may be acting as the barrier. And then another key thing is really integrating children and youth into research, design, planning, and decision-making process, and doing this in a much more systemic way. There's lots of wonderful examples of projects that are going on around the world, but it remains the exception to the rule. And so we need to embed this better in all policies, that this is just by default, we're operating in this way. So I'm going to share a little bit more detail about some of the how chapters to give you an idea of what is provided in these. So this is a chapter that I wrote with a couple of colleagues that talks about how to use the tool behavior mapping as a way to really understand how children and youth are using public places. And we use the example of a study we did for a play yard renovation it was actually at a school, and we looked at its impact on kindergartners, but it was a park that was, a yard that was also considered a public park by the community. So behavior mapping it's a tool that I use quite a bit. It's an intensive but unobtrusive field observation method. So you're actually in situ, you're in the space, you're observing children and youth as they are normally using the space, and they don't realize they're being observed. So it's not affecting their behavior. And it has a lot of value because it's one of the few tools where we can link behavior and the environment. So we can simultaneously capture details about how they're using the space, but then also how the environment is or isn't supporting their activity. So, for example, the yard that we studied, it was a yard that was due to be renovated. It was going to be expanded and redesigned, but also naturalized quite a bit. As we were able to study both before and after the renovation. And this gives you an idea. Every point on this map, every dot is an observed play event, and there's a sort of a database of data underneath each of those points, so that we can look at this behavior in a lot of different ways. So, for example, one way the designers were actually deliberately trying to provide more spaces that would foster cooperative play amongst these young children, and so we were able to look at those differences. And we're able to say, yes, not only was there an increase in cooperative play, but then we were able to connect it to the environment and understand what were the environmental features or conditions or setups that were really supporting that. So not only we know that this was successful in this attempt, but then we can also take that information forward for future designs. Another thing that we looked at, they were interested in fostering more high-intensity physical activity amongst children, and they had deliberately done some things to try to increase the activity. And they were actually a little disappointed to see that there was actually no change before and after. But because we're able to connect this, we're not just collecting the behavior data, we're collecting the environmental data. I was able to point out to them that the location of it significantly changed. Most of a good chunk, half of the high physical activity beforehand was happening on the play structure, kind of in the middle of the space, and afterward it was much, much more dispersed. So they did in fact provide many, many more opportunities for that physical activity, and actually reduce some conflict that was happening at the play structure. And so again, then we were able to look and say, okay, what were those features that were successful in supporting active play, and then that can be carried forward in future designs or worked into design guidelines. So this behavior mapping protocol that we outline is really effective we use it here for play. It's really can be applied to a whole range of different public spaces, from parks and plazas, but to trails and greenways, gardens and more natural areas, but then even to outdoor adventure or learning programs as well. So the chapter itself provides the tools to understand, what it is, and then how someone could go about using a behavior mapping protocol to understand a space that they are associated with. So then just a snapshot of a couple of other chapters. So one chapter was provided by Mara Mincer and Louise Chawla from Boulder, Colorado. And they are both associated, have been for a long time, with a child-friendly city initiative there that's been going on at least 10 years called Growing Up Boulder. And it presents highlights the activities and the tools that they've been using, and highlights what's been successful and what hasn't, so others can learn from that. So the aim of Growing Up Boulder is really to ensure that all local youth have opportunities for meaningful participation, and they make a special effort to make sure that underrepresented minorities are engaged. But it's now so embedded. It's one of the few examples where there is some sustainability. The Growing Up Boulder group meets with the city of Boulder every year, and the city lays out what their agenda is, what their initiatives are going to be, and then they collectively decide how youth are going to be integrated, how they can participate in those processes. And then Growing Up Boulder leads the initiative using a range of participatory and a lot of child-led tools to capture experiences and ideas. So for example, the photo on the top left is a photo tool that they use where children are given it in a little wooden frame that's painted green on one side and red on the other. And they take them on neighborhood tours, usually focused, in this case it was focusing on transit, and the child takes a picture of something that they like or that is supportive for them. They take it with the picture with the green side, and if it's something that they don't like or that is problematic for them, they take a picture with the red side. And then that opportunity just gives the facilitators a chance to talk to kids about those experiences. So that this group has really geared toward moving this into action. And so, for example, the youth recently made mass transit recommendations that were adopted or incorporated by the city. And they recently produced, I think, the first in the US, maybe a child-friendly map of Boulder. And this group that really links the sustainability of their program to really strong partnerships. And that's a theme that runs through a number of the chapters. In order to make these longer term, these partnerships are really key. So now we go to the other side of the world. So Angela Cruz wrote a chapter about work that she's done with Aboriginal children in Australia. She's been working with communities there for a number of years, but she focused on a project, what was a co-design project. So it created or used activities that really positioned youth as the architects and planners. So one of the activities, they actually focused on some existing, what were child-focused venues in the community, and the children redesigned them to better suit their needs. But then they also looked at the community planning level and did a number of exercises there, and they made recommendations about new public amenities that they felt were needed. They had recommended a community-wide greening program, and they made suggestions for shared spaces, which really went, they weren't child-focused, they were really focused on all members of the community. And the key here is that local planners and council members were part of the process. They weren't leading it, they were there to listen and really listen, and then take those recommendations back. And as far as I know, they're in the process of trying to bring some of these recommendations to life. Okay, and then sort of back to Canada, to the West Coast. This chapter highlights some tools that were used with young people to assess how friendly their neighborhoods were for play. So this is a city just north of Vancouver on the West Coast in BC. And they used another photo method. Visual methods are really engaging with kids. So they use a method called photo voice, where children are given digital cameras, and they use those to take photos of their environment, in this case, places that were supportive of play, places or elements that were acting as barriers. But one really valuable takeaway from this group is that the researchers, before even embarking on the project, they established a youth leadership group with youth, and that those youth participants actually helped to guide and decide on the research activities. So they weren't pre-established. They participated in that. They developed them together. And then at the end of the project, that leadership group took the recommendations and sort of created action steps. What could they do to address some of the issues that emerged? And one thing that came out of that is they used some of the photos and some other elements. They created this exhibit, which was showcased in the city hall, and then the youth also presented to city counselors, shared their experiences and their recommendations for making the place more play friendly. Okay, so finally we come down to my second chapter in the how section, and this one is focused more on how do we integrate youth into the actual design and building processes. And this has continued to be a difficult challenge, particularly to do in any kind of systemic way. So this is based on a project that I did with some youth in London, Canada, again. But it sets out a framework for saying, okay, how do you do this? How do you set them up actually as co-researchers that are evaluating the space that is there and how it's being used, and then co-designers in terms of redesigning. So in this case, they were redesigning a part of their schoolyard, which was again also used as a sort of public park by the community. So the framework that's outlined has 5 phases, and it walks people through, you know, how do you introduce the idea of design and the design process to youth, going through a process saying, well, what do we need to know? What do we need to know in order to make informed design decisions? And that usually includes understanding the site, understanding the people that are using it, and understanding the opportunities and constraints. Because in this case, they were actually designing and building the space. This wasn't just a sort of a token exercise. So it takes through, you know, what the design stages, all the way up to the community building and even the aftercare. These students are responsible for the care of the space that was built. So just an example, when the stage that looks at, you know, what do we need to know? There's a number of activities that we did with the kids, and the questions, the bullet points underneath are actually the questions the children came up with to sort of guide the activities that we would do to try to answer these questions. So we went through that process, and the chapter lays out specific tools that people can use to help youth answer these questions. So for example, to understand the users, this was primarily a schoolyard play space. It shows how can youth themselves develop and lead interviews and do needs assessments, how they can conduct interviews with adults, maybe staff or parents, and they themselves actually did behavior mapping of the space, understanding how other kids in the full range of ages were using the space. And then in terms of understanding the environment and how the space was being used, there was a number of different exercises that we did, a number of site inventories and assessments. So they did quite a bit of evaluation. They were bringing a lot of experience to it because they used this space, but then they really dug deeper and to understand what were some of the challenges, what were some of the assets that were there they could work with. So sort of takeaways from the chapter itself and the process is that really youth are really capable of meaningful participation when they've got the right process and the right tools, and that this is a feasible process for municipalities and community groups, especially if you have the tools. It's feasible to engage youth yourselves in terms of projects that are coming up in your community, and really even very early on we were able to see that there were benefits for the youth, but then also for the community. So you can just see here the before and after. The student designers decided that they needed a garden space. We thought we were building a play space, and they preferred a garden. So you can see before and after, early days of the garden. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up with a couple snapshots of, we have a section that shows a number of sort of shorter case studies about what does this look like in practice, some more real projects on the ground, most of which have been carried out by non-researchers and even non-designers. So one project that's really interesting is taking place in London in the UK. There's a group, they're having the same issues, kids not playing outside, streets not being safe places for play. And what they found out is that there was some really old legislation on the books, like pre-World War II, that allowed groups, streets or community groups, to ask their local council to temporarily close some streets to operate as play streets. And so they sort of pulled this out of mothballs, and it was still on the books, so they could use it. And they've set up a system where neighborhoods or groups can apply to have their street designated as a play street. That might just be Thursday afternoons for a couple of hours after school. It might be every weekend. It might be permanent. It might be every day. And it's picking up so much that they're actually building a network. They're actually able to have enough of these streets coming together that they are linking them, and they're actually creating these play quarters. So there's actually this system of play streets that kids can navigate, and parents are a little bit more on board, knowing that these are safe environments for them. And then just going to end with a project that's actually here in Ithaca. This took place before I moved here myself. There's a local social enterprise called the Just Play Project, and they presented this work that had been done with a neighborhood here in Ithaca that was being redeveloped. The community organizers were playing a big role in the development, and they deliberately engaged local youth to try to set priorities for development. And when the youth came in and they took a look at the plans, and they said, this is not for us. There's nothing here for us. This is all for younger children. And so they themselves organized a petition, got a boatload of signatures, took it to the city, and they were actually paired with the department, got a bit of funding, and worked with a playground designer and the Just Play project group for about 6 months, and they redesigned this one area, and they didn't want to call it a playground; it's called a hangout, and it was built and installed in 2017. And a valuable piece of this is that, and I credit the city for this, that they recognized the achievement. They actually designated a day as Northside Youth Empowerment Day, and then followed on with a program to allow youth to continue to vote on the use of additional city funds that were designated for that area. So they recognized the value and have begun to embed that in some standard practices. So all this to say, when we talk about youth participation, often we think just at the design development level, but there are so many access points where youth can get involved, right from very early on, assessment and evaluation of spaces through planning and design, into construction and maintenance, and even into the policy making. So the How chapters and the Youth Inclusion in Practice really try to show the gamut of ways that youth can participate at each of these stages, or all, ideally. Really, where we land with this book is we're trying to argue, to highlight that children are a bit of an indicator species, and if we can design cities and neighborhoods and communities that are successful for children, they're going to have benefits for many others. So it's not going to solve all the problems, but there are significant benefits for the community at large. So I'm just going to leave you with a slide, a couple comments, a couple reviews we had on the book, as well as it's a big long link. I think the group is going to provide that link for you. But what I want to say is that besides being able to purchase the book there, because we're really trying to put some of these materials in the hands of everybody, there is a free 2-page takeaway summary available for every one of the chapters in the book that is free and is online, available at this the same link. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to go and take a look at that. So. Okay, so I'm going to stop. Well, I'll leave that for a second. I think you're going to share the link with the group, though. But I'll leave it there. I appreciate you listening, and I'm happy to take any questions from the crowd.
Yes. Can you hear me? Are we good? Okay, good. So thank you so much, Professor Loebach, for a wonderful talk. That I love that, the indicators, children as indicator species. That's a fabulous, fabulous concept. So the opportunity you present us for thinking and learning about how to create and maintain good public spaces for children is so important and so appreciated. Thank you very much. Questions have come in, and my name is Evelyn Ferretti. I'm the moderator, the question moderator, and I'll go ahead and start with the first one. This one's from Abigail Brown. Do you find that children are able to articulate their needs and preferences well, or does your research require more interpretation? How does this vary by method?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it really does depend on the tools that are used, and you have to be, there's a lot of research that gives us some good indicators about which tools are going to be the best for engaging and providing kids the right opportunities for articulating their needs. That obviously changes by age. I should say that the book, we're primarily focusing on ages 8 to 18. When you get to dealing with younger kids, you need different methods. But my experience of a lot of my colleagues is that children are more than capable of articulating their needs, but it really does hinge on the tools that are used. It also requires some relationship building to start. So a lot of times the engagement process starts with kids sort of well ahead of the research, because that the trust has to be built up. And we've also found that working with kids in small groups, so rather than working with kids one-on-one, but working with them like 2 or 3, they get more comfortable talking and sharing with each other. And you can get some really rich stuff. So if they're, as an adult, even if you're, you're really engaging and you're trying to gain their trust, you're still an adult. So we've found sometimes we use like older children to talk to younger children. That's been really helpful. But it's really just a matter of some time and the right tools. And it's actually amazing what how savvy kids are about their environmental experiences if you give them the right opportunities to talk about them or show. I should say too, one thing that's really helpful are tools that don't rely as much on language. So that's why some of the visual tools, the photos and the mapping and things like that can be better tools because they're not as language dependent.
So actually, there is another question that's rather related. I'll go ahead and ask that one. This one's from Gary Evans. As you know well, it can be difficult to design methodologies that match the cognitive capabilities of young children in order to get valid results. In your book, or more generally, can you point me towards any good discussions about the methodological challenges of collecting data from younger children, especially those who are not yet cognizant of letters, numbers, and so on?
Yes, there's a reason why I don't do a lot of work with younger children because it is really challenging. I do know of a couple of colleagues that do some work, and I can, Gary, I can share those with you. I don't have them on top of my head, but that is a significant extra challenge. And my experience, I've done it a little bit, is that it requires a little bit more interpretation, which is not necessarily the right interpretation. And I tend to work with kids sort of 8 and above, so I don't have a lot of good insight for you on the younger children, and that's why we sort of separated the book, because it's a different world with younger kids. But I'll try to send some things your way.
All right. Next question is from Kim Rawlings. Thanks for a great talk. Do you have a sense of whether mixed use, walkable development that encourages walking and other health benefits tends to include or exclude youth? Can strategies you mentioned be used to promote more inclusive development and redevelopment for children and youth?
Right. Ooh, big question. Yes, there's definitely a lot of overlap with some of the work that's looking to make more communities more walkable. Certainly because children and youth are, when they can, they're big users of pedestrian infrastructure. And so they automatically, with any trends toward or work toward walkable environments, that will naturally benefit children and youth. I forgot the second part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, sorry. The second part was, can strategies you mentioned be used to promote more inclusive development and redevelopment for children and youth?
Development, I'm assuming in terms of like community planning development. So yes, the we intentionally looked for contributors that were really sort of spanning the different scales. So some are talking about, very specific spaces, but there are a number that talk at that development planning level. And I think some of the most interesting ones I've seen that have come out are those that have set up some sort of youth advisory council, a youth parliament, some sort of youth advisory group that is actively and connected to, particularly to cities, municipalities, are informing them about and weighing in on development plans. Those are still, few and far between, and a lot of them are still kind of fledgling, but they do seem to hold a lot of promise for supporting it at that development level, if that answered your question, Kim.
Yeah, and that wraps up the, sorry, there's one has come in. I apologize, just yet one more, and this is another question from Abigail Brown. Have you seen any evidence that introducing more nature into youth-friendly spaces positively influences children's development of pro-environmental behaviors or learning outcomes related to environmental knowledge? So,
yes. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Seb. Sorry, I was just gonna. It's the connection between these spaces and children's attitude towards environment.
Yes, so I haven't myself done work to look at the connection between. I do a fair bit of work that looks at children's behavior and perceptions of natural environments, but not whether that is translating to other pro-environmental behavior. But there's definitely work out there, a growing body of work that is making the connection that this increased exposure to nature and natural environments, which children living in cities are not getting. I'll have to stay in the dark here. Children in cities don't have as much access to these natural environments. So when more nature is being introduced, there's a sense that this can impact generally more pro-environmental behavior. It's not something I've looked at, and actually I don't think any of the chapters themselves have, but there's enough of a body of work there to suggest that there would be a connection. We need some more research.
Thank you, Professor Loebach. One more question for Christina Twomey, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that last name. Are there any studies that you know of specifically focused on ways to create safe and effective barriers between play spaces and streets in smaller city spaces that aren't traditional fences?
Not that I can recall offhand, but I do know of a couple of good resources that have been put out by, particularly by design or planning firms. ARUP has developed one that's called Designing for Urban Childhoods, and they, I know they focus on and they showcase a number of different projects, and this is ringing a bell that I may have seen something there. Not particularly in our book. I can't recall seeing research on that specifically. I think there might be some case studies that might be valuable. I would look for some of the online resources coming out of some of the design and planning firms that are focused more on projects. There might be some good ideas there.
Okay, and then the last one might be a quick question. It relates to one of your behavior mapping, the slide that you'd shown on behavior mapping. Christina asks, what does MVPA stand for?
Sorry, I tried to de-jargon it. It's the short form for moderate to vigorous physical activity. So it's the activity in that more intense range that there's been a lot of work focusing on obesity in the last 10 years, and there's been a lot of work that's focused on they've been trying to target that MVPA to try to increase opportunities for children to get to that higher intensity level because of the potential benefits for obesity. So sorry for the jargon.
Well, that wraps up our questions. Professor Loebach. I think we're done with that. Oh, sorry. One more. Professor Gary Evans comments that Donald Appleyard, research on Warner child-safe streets, mentions that.
Yeah, there's some great. Europe tends to do a better job at sorting out some of these interesting urban solutions, design solutions. So the Warner is a good model. Thanks for the reminder, Gary. Thank you.
One more question here. They're still coming in. Do you find, this is from Jenny Leonavood, do you find that young people have an interest in transportation that is available to them, walking, biking, or mostly on play and hangout spaces?
No, they are surprisingly, I'm always shocked. This is the thing I find so wonderful working with kids. What I always think they're going to talk about is not what they talk about. The play stuff comes later. The access to this space is a huge issue. And so it tends to be something we hear about first. Transportation, lack of sidewalks. Certainly there's issues that they may not be allowed to go further by their parents, but if the environments were safer and the pedestrian infrastructure was better, or the transportation that they had access to was better, there might be, parents would feel a little bit safer. They might actually have more mobility. So sidewalks and trails, things like that. Some of the first things I hear from kids, even 8, 9 years old, they are aware that access is the first piece often.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Loebach. We've run out of questions for you.
I haven't figured out how to turn my light back on, so I really appreciate the opportunity to come and present. I hope there was some interesting bits for everybody, and I just appreciate everyone's time.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Loebach, for ending our Fall 2020 Library Book Talk series on such a high note with such an important topic, one that ultimately impacts members of our whole society, no matter what the age. Before closing our event, I'd like to note that today's talk has been recorded and will be made available on Mann Library's YouTube channel, the URL for which should be posted in the chat box shortly. And I should mention that at that same URL, you will also find recordings of all of the talks that we have hosted for the semester, along with an extensive library of previously recorded book talks at Mann. Again, I thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you all a wonderful evening.
This has been a production of Cornell University Library.